KCRW sponsors include Roadside Attractions, presenting Trial by Fire. Based on a true-life Texas story, Trial by Fire stars Jack O'Connell as a death row inmate and Laura Dern as his ally who fights for his freedom. Now playing in theaters.
This is Josh Barrow, and welcome to Left, Right, and Center, your civilized yet provocative antidote to the self-contained opinion bubbles that dominate political debate. It's the third week of May, and this week we moved a lot closer to a court challenge that could significantly reduce or even eliminate constitutional protections for abortion rights. Alabama's legislature voted overwhelmingly to ban abortion in the state, even in cases of rape or incest, and to impose a penalty of up to 99 years in prison on people who perform abortions. The law does not seek to impose a criminal penalty on women who seek abortions. Lawmakers in Ohio, Georgia, Kentucky, and Iowa have passed so-called heartbeat bills that can prohibit abortions after a fetal heartbeat can be detected, approximately 6 weeks into pregnancy. While those are not blanket bans, they do impose such an early cutoff as to leave many women little or no time to obtain an abortion once they know they're pregnant. Countries that permit elective abortion typically allow it with little restriction for at least the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. Some of these bans have already been blocked by the courts, and the expectation is none of them will go into effect unless and until the Supreme Court weighs in and says they can. But will it? Justice Anthony Kennedy was the linchpin of the court's abortion jurisprudence in recent decades. He was a co-author of the 1992 Planned Parenthood v. Casey decision, which upheld the essential holding of Roe v. Wade while allowing some restrictions on abortion so long as they did not impose a, quote, undue burden on a woman's ability to obtain an abortion before fetal viability. Now, all the co-authors of Casey have retired, and there is a 5-justice majority on the court that may be inclined to overturn Roe or significantly narrow it. To discuss what those laws mean and what the courts are likely to do with them, we will be joined later in the show by my New York Magazine colleague Irin Carmon, who covers the Supreme Court for us. Now let's bring in our Left, Right, and Center panel. As always, I'm your center, and I'm joined by Rich Lowry, editor of National Review on the right. On the left is Elizabeth Brunig of the Washington Post. Hello.
Hi, Josh.
Hey, Josh.
There was other news this week. Rich, what have you been watching?
Well, we finally have the immigration proposal that Jared Kushner has been working on for some time, causing a lot of agita among conservatives who don't trust him and his political instincts. But I think it's a pretty good proposal. It would change the mix of legal immigration to put more focus on skills, more in keeping with what countries like how countries like Canada and Australia run their systems, and proposes a whole host of enforcement measures that I think would be very helpful. The problem, of course, is that this is going to go nowhere, and a frustration is that this is kind of proposal you should propose 3 months into your administration when you have unified Republican control and have some chance to pass it, rather than proposing now when it's just a campaign document at best.
Liz, there was some interesting coverage this week of Jared Kushner's adventures on the Hill and how Republican senators did not seem very impressed with him.
You know, it seems like he's the kind of figure who could have been big in Republican politics 10 years ago or something like that. If you can imagine a Romney administration, you can see a place for a Jared Kushner in it. I just don't think he's in keeping with the current energy of the Republican Party or the direction that they've been going on much of anything, much less immigration.
I mean, Rich, the funny thing about this coverage was it was describing how he was sent up there with Stephen Miller to present this plan, so representing sort of the two opposite ideological ends within the staff in the West Wing around this issue. But then it really seems like a Miller proposal in that it both changes the criteria of who gets to immigrate, which you're describing, copying from Canada and Australia roughly, but it also proposes a significant overall reduction in the quantity of immigration. You know, Canada and Australia are both countries with very high percentages of the population that are foreign born. And so it seems like, you know, you talk about you should have proposed this when you had unified Republican control. Shouldn't they be proposing something that has something that's of interest to Democrats, something that's of interest to Republicans who are more pro-immigration, where, you know, if you want to change the criteria, you don't ask for less immigration in total, or maybe you even allow more immigration? It doesn't seem like they've tried to develop this plan at all in a way such that it could actually become a law.
Well, it doesn't have cuts in the levels of legal immigration, which is what a lot of people my side of this debate would like to see, and I'm sure Stephen Miller would like to see. But otherwise, you're right. The changes to the nature of the system are what immigration restrictions Stephen Miller have wanted for a long time, and I think they potentially popular and saleable if we weren't just so far down the road, and the debate on immigration even getting more hostile and the lines getting clearer drawn than they were before, and two, with Democrats controlling Congress. So you you're not going to have any changes without some sort of dreamer bill or even a larger amnesty.
Liz, what have you been watching?
So it's been a rough month for morality in politics, that is, doing anything more than just sort of technocratic tinkering. If you like that kind of thing, you're always playing a very high-stakes game because it can go very bad or it can go very good. And in the realm of going very well, I think, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez unveiled last week what they're calling the Loan Shark Prevention Act, which is a pretty sweeping proposal that would shut down predatory lending. And it would do this in part by federally capping interest rates at 15%, which would, of course, decimate the payday loan industry, would also be a massive change for the credit card industry, and would get rid of some of those interest rates you sometimes see reaching into the triple digits. These are predatory loans. They rely on poor people needing money fast and then, of course, end up extracting much more than they were ever given to begin with. This can lead to a cycle of poverty and debt. Bernie and AOC realize, I think, that this will lead to a reversal in what we've seen in the course of economic deregulation, which is a sort of mass democratization of credit. It would probably lead to a reduced supply of that. What their argument is that's probably a good thing.
Rich, this is an idea that has a lot of popularity among the public, and you even saw Tucker Carlson using his show this week to promote the idea that usury is bad and that we should have some sorts of limitations on how much interest lenders can charge.
Yeah, I just think it's fraught with unattended consequences in terms of it would change how credit card companies operate, and probably people with good credit scores would lower interest rates for them and then cut off people who don't have such good credit scores from credit, and certainly cut off poor people from credit. And the payday lending industry, I mean, no one wants to defend it because these interest rates are so appallingly high on the face of it, but studies, at least some of them, show that actually it fulfills a necessary niche and is better than the alternative, given a lot of poor people have desperate day-to-day needs. And the idea that we're going to replace this with some sort of government program, it would just, in effect, be, unless it also has really high interest rates and kind of reacts to the market realities, it will just be, in effect, giving away money to people, which is a typical Bernie Sanders and AOC proposal.
Typical and typically great. I think that one of the great things about the proposal of capping interest rates at 15% is that it does put the focus on the demand for this kind of credit and what is going on in the lives of poor people that causes them to have these sort of instantaneous, pressing, very serious needs for huge amounts of money that they then get exploited by and looped into cycles of crushing debt. I think that focusing our attention in terms of programs on how to reduce those extraordinary crushing daily needs is extremely important. And I think you see that in the Bernie AOC left. You see proposals, for example, regarding more social housing. A lot of these loans can go to rent. You see now there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about the sort of tech industry moving into rent loans, which, again, usually have this astronomically high interest and become enormously difficult for poor people to ever dig their way out of after even one go.
You did note, though, something that I think you agree with Rich on, which is that this regulation is likely to reduce the supply of credit, that there are some loans that can't be made at less than 15% and just won't be made at all. And I guess I have two questions about that. One is it sort of paternalistic to say to these people, well, this loan is not good for you, and because it cannot be given to you at a price at which would work for you, you shouldn't be able to take out the loan? And then what do you do for people who, you can have a grand vision about social housing and various ways you're going to change the economy so that there's fewer people face pressing acute financial crises in their lives. But you're not going to be able to eliminate that, and you're especially not going to be able to eliminate it quickly. We're not going to build millions of units of social housing very quickly. So are there people who really do have needs for this access to credit? Are they going to be put in worse situations when they can't borrow the money at all, even at a very high interest rate?
I think you can conceive of those cases. I mean, I always want to bite the bullet because it would be ridiculous to say there's never going to be a single case where someone wouldn't have benefited in very unusual circumstances from an extremely high interest loan. But I also think that, Bernie Sanders' vision and AOC's vision is one that does come with lots of moving parts. And that's because the problems that we face as a society, as opposed to the approach of, sort of technocratic tinkering around the edges, really are big, multiform problems that branch throughout the entire network of the way we live, through the economy, through society, through politics. So a holistic approach is really all you can do if you want to do something.
This week, I've been watching Trump's saber-rattling with China, where talks over trade seem to have deteriorated. The president imposed more tariffs. The Chinese retaliated in kind with their own tariffs. I actually think the president has a reasonable objection here to the way the Chinese have been negotiating. They sort of came to his team and said that they didn't want to agree to changes that would require changes in domestic Chinese law, even though you would need to change certain aspects of domestic Chinese law if they were going to open their markets to U.S. firms, in ways that seem reasonable to me to be asking for in a trade negotiation. But I'm not sure what the president's end game is, and I think he's asking for too much because there's this set of asks about the Chinese playing fair and basically, don't steal American technology, allow American companies to compete within your country, that sort of thing. But then he's also asking for a specific target to reduce our trade deficit by China just agreeing to buy more of our stuff. First of all, I'm not sure there's enough consumption capacity within China to move the trade balance as much as the president wants. There's only so many soybeans they need in China. And it's also kind of like pushing a boulder up a hill, and that the president makes these threats. He imposes tariffs on China. That's bad for China's economic prospects. It causes China's currency to fall. And then that makes it harder for the Chinese to buy American exports, and it makes it cheaper for us to buy Chinese goods. So I don't really think the president gets how the balance of trade works, and I don't think he has a strategy here that's going to be able to achieve his goals, particularly around the trade deficit. Rich, what have you made of the recent developments on China?
Well, I've been very surprised because it just seemed to me we were headed for a deal, and it seemed to be that a deal would make sense for both sides because the Chinese, you make various assurances that you don't follow through on ultimately, and maybe you agree to buy more soybeans, but that doesn't really affect you or your economic model one way or the other very much. And for Trump, he gets to wave around a diplomatic and economic victory and say he's done more on this than any president in the last 20 years, which even a papered over deal would be true. And then you get to take a second bite of the apple if you win a second term and do this, I think, a smarter way, which would be going back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership and mustering allies to further pressure China on some of these core questions about technology transfer and theft and all the rest of it. But instead, the whole thing is blown up. And weirdly, for 2 years, I would have thought, well, if it blows up because the government is shambolic and doesn't know what it's doing, that's unfortunately going to be us. But it looks like it was the Chinese, and the China watchers have all sorts of explanations of why the sudden shift in their negotiating posture happened. One is that Xi is really busy and traveling a lot, so it didn't focus on it. One, amazingly enough, is that they didn't have a Chinese translation of the document that both sides were working off of. And then when they saw that, they thought about it differently. But for whatever reason, they backed off, and Trump is hit them and they've hit us, and it could be that this showdown takes us through 2020.
Liz, I think this is an issue where people on the left are somewhat sympathetic to at least some of the things that the Trump administration is asking for here. I guess the question is, would there be a different strategy, say in a Bernie Sanders presidency, trying to recut our deal with China?
You would at least hope for accurate translations of the deal to have been prepared in advance.
Well, but that's up to the Chinese.
That's true. That's true. You can't take all the responsibility upon yourself. But I think that you would see probably a more incremental approach. You would probably see what was aimed at being a more collaborative approach as China's economy becomes its own sort of massive juggernaut. They, of course, also have interests and demands. But it's true that you do see some sympathy from the left on issues of unrestricted or unregulated trade. And you see an interest in constricting trade, if you want to call it that, in a way that would help protect American workers. I don't know if that is Trump's primary interest. I don't know how much of his interest in changing America's trade relationships has to do with sort of xenophobia or nostalgia for a kind of American economy that doesn't exist anymore and probably isn't likely to exist again. But I would hope to see more success out of a Sanders administration, and maybe that would come from a more incremental approach to trade.
Rich, can you help me understand what's been going on with Iran lately? Because I've been reading stuff like the New York Times on Thursday basically describing how this is another situation where the president seems to have been only partially aware of what's going on within his own administration, contacting his defense secretary and saying, I want to make sure that we don't go to war with Iran. Is this a case where some of the president's aides have gotten out ahead of him and sort of, making threats and escalating things that the president did not intend to escalate?
I'm not sure about that. I think the policy that everyone agrees on, and it's a symptom of how strange this presidency, and that it is that's kind of a you have to have that caveat for what really is a decision, is whether everyone agrees with it, including the aides who are supposed to be answering to him. But the policy is deterrence, pushing Iran, squeezing Iran. But I just think the commentary on this the last 5 days or so has been a symptom of a panic. Trump fundamentally, and I know it's odd because he's so impulsive, is more cautious in the Middle East than his prior two predecessors, and he does not want war with Iran. It wouldn't surprise me, if there's some shots fired at sea, but the idea that we're going to have a major conflict with Iran or invade Iran, I just think it is highly unlikely.
Do you find that reassuring, Liz?
I find the entire thing very disturbing. It's very reminiscent of Iraq, from what I can remember. And I was fairly young when the Iraq War began, but have since been through many iterations of struggle sessions over everyone who voted for it, which has been enough to remind me of what the essential rhetoric felt like. And this kind of unbalanced will we, won't we, are there intimations of trouble and rumblings ahead stuff does seem very reminiscent. I like that Trump doesn't want to go to war, and the one thing that I've always found consistently admirable about him is he does seem opposed to foreign wars that don't help the United States or the countries that we end up invading. And I hope that holds here.
You hope that he ends up in charge of his own administration in that regard.
Lord, forgive me.
Let's take a break. I will be back with Rich Lowry of National Review and Elizabeth Brunig of The Washington Post to talk about abortion laws. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
What do you think? Share your thoughts on today's show on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW and download the KCRW app to listen to Left, Right, and Center on demand.
The rock band Fanny ruled the Sunset Strip of the 1970s, and they were supposed to be the next big thing.
How does it feel to be like a girl playing an instrument? Well, how does it feel to be a man asking stupid questions? I mean, what?
I'm Jessica Hopper, and on Lost Notes, Fanny explains the price women pay for being ahead of their time. Subscribe to KCRW's Lost Notes wherever you get your podcasts.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm Josh Barrow of New York Magazine. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Elizabeth Brunig, columnist at The Washington Post. I talked a little bit at the top of the show about the flurry of state laws that would impose severe restrictions on abortion or even prohibit it if the Supreme Court allows those laws to go into effect. Irin Carmon is now joining us to talk about what those laws would do and what the courts are likely to do with them. Irin is a senior correspondent and my colleague at New York Magazine. Hi, Irin. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So there's been a lot of claims about these laws going around on social media, and I think people are confused about what exactly each law in each state would do. And for example, I've seen people claiming that Georgia has made it a crime for women to leave the state to obtain an abortion. Can you go over what exactly these states have proposed to prohibit and what consequences there would be for abortion providers and for pregnant women in these states as a result of the new rules if they are allowed to take effect?
So, of course, in the short term, what we expect is that all of these bans that run nakedly afoul of Roe v. Wade will not be enforced. So anything that is an outright ban, the Supreme Court has said for about a half century, is on the face of it unconstitutional. And there's no reason in the short term for lower courts to see it any differently. So I think that the answer is we don't really know how they would be enforced if they were able to be enforced. In the long term, my personal belief is that it would take maybe one justice turning over at the Supreme Court to actually learn how these laws might be enforced in effect. With respect to, for example, claims about investigating miscarriages. In Alabama, women are already being investigated and charged related to their pregnancy outcomes. If they are suspected of using drugs while pregnant, they are prosecuted as if their fetus is a person under the same law that's about chemical endangerment, about kids being near meth labs. So there is a precedent for laws that target pregnant women's behavior being interpreted by prosecutors in the most aggressive possible way. So while a lot of people are speculating this week and in the short term these laws won't be enforced, I think in the long term it's absolutely possible that some of these worst case scenarios are going to come true.
Rich, do you think it's fair to talk about the so-called heartbeat bills as being tantamount to near-total abortion bans? The way they're framed is that it's a ban on abortion once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, which is approximately 6 weeks into pregnancy. But it sort of seems like the practical effect is to make it very difficult for women to get an abortion after they realize that they're pregnant. And I think that also seems to be the intention of the lawmakers, that these are coming from people who would like prohibitions on abortion. Yeah,
I think it's as close as you can probably practically get to a total ban on abortions, and this represents a different tactic by the pro-life movement. For the last 20 years or so, really the focus has been on the fringe cases of the other side, partial birth abortions, late-term abortions, the kind of statements we saw from Ralph Northam and action we've seen in blue state legislatures around abortion. This is the opposite approach, and I think there's something to be said for it. I think focusing people on how early a fetus has a heartbeat is an important educative function, but I don't find it plausible that Roberts Court is going to take any of these laws and use it to overturn Roe, even if the court wanted to overturn Roe, which unfortunately I think there needs to be another conservative justice for that to happen. Roberts wouldn't want all the headlines and all the cable chatter about the Supreme Court just illegalized abortion, prior to after the first 6 weeks, or just blessed the Alabama abortion ban. That is not he's institutionalist and incrementalist, and he wouldn't want that political spin around any decision that in any way erodes Roe, let alone overturns it.
Irin, do you buy that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Rich talked about the function of these laws. The heartbeat bill is basically a ban, factually speaking, because you have to learn that you're pregnant within that cycle. You can't get an abortion if you don't know you're pregnant, despite the fact that legislators in various states intimated this week that it was possible. I do think that these laws are, even if they don't take effect, are intentionally trying to change public opinion, to stigmatize abortion, to focus on humanizing or personifying aspects of very, very early embryological development. Actually, doctors will tell you that at 6 weeks, it's not a heartbeat. It's like an electromagnetic pulse. There is no heart to beat. But of course, this is part of a story that the anti-abortion movement is telling about wanting full personhood to begin at conception, or as close as we can get to figuring out when it is. So I think that's why I said, listen, Stephen Breyer is 80. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 86. Sonia Sotomayor has diabetes. I don't know Elena Kagan's health, but it is true that it is possible within the next few years, in a second Trump term, we could be debating, not whether John Roberts is an incrementalist, and I think he probably is, but I think we could be debating a total ban. And I wrote this week in particular that I've always been assuming that the incremental path is the path that the court is going to go on. But that's just talking about the next couple of years. These are lifetime appointments. So I think we could if we look beyond the short term, it is not crazy. It is not hysterical. And by the way, I would like to thank some of these legislators in Alabama and Missouri, in Georgia, and Ohio and so on, because, in fact, they've really clarified the stakes. For the longest time, there's been a kind of gaslighting around abortion restrictions. Rich referred to the edge cases. Another way is saying, for example, these restrictions that the court is likely to hear in the short term that claim to be regulating clinics for the purpose of women's health. The Supreme Court has already said that you can't create bogus rationales for shutting down clinics. But it is really easy to hear about that and say, well, yeah, maybe there should be, admitting privileges for doctors or whatever. The practical effect is only one clinic or zero clinics left, zero clinics in Mississippi, only one clinic left in Louisiana, and so on. And so that kind of subtle chipping away at abortion in a way, and it's difficult to get people excited about it, but that kind of subtle chipping away has always been about banning abortion in effect. And so what these legislators are doing, I think, is putting the lie to the fact that this is about common sense legislation and really showing that the ultimate goal here is to make abortion completely inaccessible except for wealthy people who will always be able to subvert the rules.
Liz, when we talk about the heartbeat bills and the 6 week cutoff and the electromagnetic pulse, a lot of this seems to be a proxy for figuring out what the moral status of a fetus is, and basically arguing that, well, at this point it gains a certain moral status that deserves certain protection from the state. And that's, I think, a large part of the story about abortion regulation around the world is that you have a debate that's driven by two fairly pure approaches that say, only the mother has a relevant moral right, or the fetus has a relevant moral right to life, and that's the only thing that trumps it. You see so much of sort of trying to achieve middle positions. And I guess, what do you make of that? Does the fetus have a relevant moral interest that the state needs to consider, and what does that mean in terms of where and when abortion should be allowed?
I think it's especially complicated because in liberal societies, you use the democratic apparatus to try to settle these metaphysical questions behind almost every law. And we were talking earlier about usury. Even behind laws regarding interest on loans, there's a metaphysical question there. It has to do with what things are meant for, like wealth, and what exploitation is, and how evil it is, and why, and what the nature of the human person is. And abortion is one of those issues where those metaphysical questions are really front and center. And so you do have two very pure approaches that, for instance, the fetus, or I guess at that point the blastocyst, the zygote, has an immediate claim on human life. And then you have the other approach, which is not until birth. And then you have this vast world in between of people who probably don't have a completely thought out or explicable position on when a fetus becomes a person. They just know when they see in the news that a woman who was 36 weeks pregnant and was killed by her partner, they feel like that's two murders. Or they know that when a friend of theirs lost a baby at just 5 or 6 weeks, that didn't feel so much like the loss of a toddler. And so you have a great gray area. And I mean, I think that for me, the most important thing in sorting out the sort of metaphysical issue in terms of how it translates to law has been to say the penal carceral system is never a good institution to involve when you're trying to thread these very delicate issues of who has claims on human life. So like Irin was saying, you have these laws where women who are pregnant in certain states can be prosecuted for drug use and punished by the penal carceral system. I'm not even sure that's a good thing to do for mothers with 5-year-olds who are using drugs when the children are around drugs or drug paraphernalia. Does it really solve the problem? Are you really getting down to the base issue of someone having an addiction? What forms addictions? What puts people in the position to have addictions in society that they then expose their children to? What leads to cycles of addiction? For me, the answer there is not involving the police and prisons. And so I think that in the course of trying to solve this issue, people have relied heavily on sort of penal measures, which don't help answer the questions. And even if they do provide a kind of hard black and white response, it feels morally unsatisfactory because it is.
I take your point, Liz, and I think I just want to say that we do have a compromise position that kind of reconciles people's complicated feelings about the status of the fetus, and that's called Roe v. Wade. And it says, that the bright line for an elective abortion that the states can draw is viability. And so the day before birth abortion myth, it only exists in the case of severe health issues, the proverbial 11-year-old rape victim. And so I do think acting as if this is a debate between people who, want heartbeat bills and people who want women to have abortions at 40 weeks, it's not the reality on the ground. And it also doesn't reflect public opinion. The vast majority of people want abortion to be legal. Fetal viability is where Roe drew the line, and that is a compromise.
But the vast majority of people want abortion to be legal, at least in certain circumstances. And depending on how you ask the question, you get sort of different shades of that. But a lot of people who do favor legal abortion favor more restrictions than would be allowed under the Roe model. I mean, in particular, these restrictions about abortion after 20 weeks poll fairly well, I believe. It actually sort of depends on whether you ask the question. If you ask people, should abortion be illegal in most cases, that's not a very popular position. But if you ask people, should abortion be legal only in a few cases, that becomes more popular. And so, Irin, my question
Josh,
is...
if you ask people if abortion after 20 weeks is legal, if someone has a severe, fetal diagnosis or if it threatens their health, and they also say that it should be legal, I agree with you. It can totally... And by the way, I believe it's 85% of abortions happen before 20 weeks. So yes, it is absolutely true that people have trouble with these later abortions, but the centrality that these take in our debate is proportionate to the actual reality on the ground, I think, is a political tactic of the right.
And I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which that's absolutely true. I was recently in Texas reporting on evangelicals who still support Trump, so they've been through a couple of years now, and this guy they took a chance on, I wanted to kind of see where they were heading in terms of going into 2020. And one of the issues that they were most excited about and most energized by in terms of heading to the polls was exactly what you remarked on in the beginning of this segment with Ralph Northam. They have come to believe that extremely late-term elective abortion, so a woman having an abortion just on a whim at 39, 38 weeks or so forth, more pregnant than I am now, I'm at 31, that is a live issue to them now. They believe that's actually being debated. And I think that these bills and the rhetoric around them is intentionally formulated to advance that belief, even though, as Irin says, that's not necessarily on the table. I don't think anyone is advocating around that, but there's
You couldn't get a provider
disconnect.
to do that.
Right. And there's a real disconnect between the two sides where they're not hearing each other, I think.
So Roe, it's not a compromise. I mean, Roe basically makes it impossible to have any meaningful restriction on abortion because it has this medical exception that is very vague and basically can be exploited by anyone to have an abortion almost any time. And even if the court did come up with quote-unquote compromise on the issue, that's not the issue. That's not the role of the Supreme Court. It's up to the American people to decide this important political and social and moral question. And that's one thing I think, like the Alabama bill, is a tactical mistake, but I do think having the spate of pro-life legislation is very important in showing that this is a live issue. It's a debate. We've been told repeatedly pro-lifers are going to go away. They're going to be overtaken by history. They're on the wrong side of history ever since the 1970s, and we haven't gone away. And this is a legitimate point of view that deserves to be litigated democratically the way we do other social and moral questions. And just on the issue of a pregnant woman using illegal drugs in a way that would harm her unborn child, it seems to me that's just a classic common sense case that child could be affected for the rest of his or her life, because that child is a human life, by the recklessness and selfishness of his or her mother. So you can say these I don't know the specifics of the laws we're talking about, but that they're too penal, but that there's a moral concern there because there's a second party who is involuntarily being affected by the mother's abuse of drugs. That's just a real live moral concern. And I think most Americans would just think that's common sense.
I want to ask you about that moral concern you're identifying, though, because just a little while ago you said that the Alabama law was a strategic mistake. And so if the moral concern around the fetus is as simple as it's a human life and life deserves protection, it seems like you should want a total ban on abortion. And furthermore, it seems like that would imply that there should be a criminal penalty for women who seek abortions, which you don't see conservatives going for, even in the case of the Alabama law, which is a relatively extreme version of this. And so I guess my question for you then is, what for you is the moral status of a fetus? Because it seems to me that at least implicitly, conservatives, even though they're placing a great deal of value on protection of the fetus, they're not treating it as equivalent to a human life. And so what is that moral status? And then when you consider a woman's interest in bodily independence and saying, you know, the state imposes all sorts of obligations on parents toward their children, but they're not limitless, and saying to someone that you must carry this person inside your body is an extremely invasive thing for the government to do. And I think has been a traditional reason that people have been reluctant to impose, you know, full and complete bans on abortion. So how do you strike that balance? Because it seems to me that you're not simply treating the fetus as having a life right equivalent to a born human.
Yeah, so a couple things. I think the Alabama law is a tactical mistake because these laws can't go into effect. So the most important strategic aim you should have is affecting public opinion. And if it's a law that's easily shot at as extreme, it doesn't help you in that battle for public opinion. I believe life should have protection from the time of conception, but I don't think the purpose of abortion laws should be punishment. It should be protection of that fetus, of that unborn child. And I think the law would, as a practical matter, just have to recognize the fact that a lot of doctors, a lot of women have what I consider a mistaken view of the moral status of this unborn child in a way they wouldn't, a 5-month-old infant or a 5-year-old toddler. But the idea would be to afford as much protection as possible to unborn life.
But why is a criminal penalty, just to reiterate Josh's question, why is a criminal penalty appropriate when someone is addicted to drugs, which is a public health problem, and not when somebody decides they can't be pregnant anymore? Why is that not also equally something that you want to use the penal carceral system for?
The tradition has been, and I think is appropriate, is to go after the doctors, not the mother.
But that's just politics, right? If you think it's murder.
Well, it seems to me that that's an implicit recognition that this is a less morally bad act than murder.
It's an implicit recognition of what I said, that everyone agrees a toddler is a human being. I think a unborn child is also a human being, because if you don't interfere with the trajectory of this unborn being, unless something, there's tragic miscarriage, it becomes a human being. It's that simple. And I don't want to play. We're going to get into sort of dorm room arguments over the morality of abortion, which don't convince anyone of anything. But if it's terribly invasive for the state to say to women they have to carry children to term, so that logically you would be in favor of abortions all the way up to 9 months, right?
I think the dorm room arguments have been weirdly a little bit missing from this conversation, and that as Liz notes, there's an underlying metaphysical question here that tells us how to balance these interests, and I think people haven't really been discussing that very much. They've been starting from an outset position about which right is more important and arguing that way, and I think it's left out a lot of people in the middle who do feel cross-pressured on this. Liz, I wanted to ask you a little bit about something that we were talking about before the show, which is that among your objections to using the penal system around abortion is that you see all sorts of unintended consequences, but you also see other public policies that you think would significantly reduce the abortion rate.
Right. You can look at surveys where women explain why they have abortions, and not all abortions have to do with financial pressure, but a lot of them do. And so I think a starting point where you could find a lot of consensus between people who consider themselves or self-identify as pro-choice or people who self-identify as pro-life is the statement that, abortion is the law of the land right now. It's federally legal, at least at this point. So if you want to reduce rates, why not start with public policies that reduce demand? And so those would be policies that make sure that women aren't impoverished, policies that make sure that if you have a drug addiction and you go for help while you're pregnant, you're not going to be taken to the police, rehabilitation, health care, all of these kinds of services that we can provide with public policy that would potentially reduce the demand for abortion and would have all kinds of knock-on effects that everybody should be able to get on board with. They would just produce happier, healthier women, children, families. A child allowance is one. Paid maternity leave is another. If you don't have paid leave from your job and your job is absolutely essential to your survival and the survival of your family and kids you already have, of course a pregnancy is going to look like a complete disaster to you, because it is, in your case, financially. So there are all kinds of problems on the table that we could solve with public policy that I think you can rationally expect to reduce demand. And you can see that abortion is linked to poverty globally, worldwide. And so that there is a relationship there. So why not start reducing the poverty? You don't have to want to reduce abortion rates to agree that we should reduce poverty. You can actually coalition with people on that front who have different motives or different perspectives. But ultimately, I think a lot of those programs are ripe for that kind of support.
Irin, I was a little surprised to hear you say early in this segment that you agree that Roberts is probably an incrementalist and that we're probably not going to see an overturn of Roe soon. There was this dissenting opinion by Associate Justice Stephen Breyer. It was about a completely unrelated matter having to do with suing states and other states' courts. But he was issuing essentially what looked like a warning that he thought that this willingness to overturn a longstanding precedent in this case about sovereign immunity indicated that the court was preparing to overturn longstanding precedents like Roe. What did you make of that warning?
Well, we don't know which precedent he was referring to. So I think it is absolutely the case that Stephen Breyer is not a hysterical type. As I joked on Twitter, he's not somebody who is frequently freaking out about what the court is doing. In recent months, he's been using his voice a lot more. But keep in mind that he authored the 2016 opinion, Whole Woman's Health, that said that you can't come up with bogus restrictions as a pretext to put abortion clinics out of business. So he may well have been referring to that case. The court also has been asked to hear, because the court has been asked to hear challenges to Whole Woman's Health in Louisiana. The court's also been asked to hear laws out of Indiana.
For people who aren't familiar, these are the sorts of restrictions that say, like, you can only have an abortion clinic if you have admitting privileges at a hospital within X number of miles, and then there's no hospital willing to give the admitting privileges. Or if
the clinic has to be kitted out like a hospital. These are literally anti-abortion strategists sitting in a room trying to figure out how to close down clinics. There's an extensive record saying that they do not make women any safer. Abortion is extremely safe. It's in fact 14 times safer than childbirth. So I think that that's also a public relations stunt. Louisiana is trying to enforce its version of this law, and the court could decide to take the case, in some way distinguish it from Whole Woman's Health in 2016 that said that you can't pass these kinds of restrictions. It's possible that that's what Breyer was referring to, but part of this is, and Rich, I think, has been part of this conversation. There is an ongoing battle for the heart and soul of John Roberts, and I don't know what the way he sees it. I do know that it's possible that he agrees with Rich that it would be very bad for the Republican Party for the court to uphold an abortion ban in full before the public is ready. That would galvanize Democrats. He talked about there being the headline saying, Roberts signs off on banning abortion.
I was trying to explain what I think Roberts' point of view. I would.
So you think
I would
you
be
should
happy.
uphold them?
I would happy. The court should strike down Roe because it has no real legitimacy within the Constitution, and we should have a debate about this. And we have big disagreements, on this show and around this table, but we would hash them out the way we do every other question that isn't explicitly forbidden or mandated by the Constitution. This was some of the court's worst decisions that stand up very badly in history. When the court just tries to settle a social question, it's what it did in Dred Scott, it's what it did in Roe, and that's just not its role and not what it should do. And this is a democracy, and actually people could probably make up their minds themselves, and there'll be compromises, and some states will have more restrictive laws, some states won't. But that's the way this country works on all sorts of other questions, and it's a pretty good system.
Rich, it sounds very reasonable until it's your uterus that's being up for debate. And again, I keep talking about these public opinion polls that show broad support for legalizing abortion. The democratic process has become so profoundly distorted by a really engaged, active minority, and God bless them. They figured out.
So you're afraid you might lose?
No, I'm afraid that the most disempowered people's voices won't be heard in that process.
Well, I think unborn children
it's a question of fundamental rights
as well, and their voice is usually totally disregarded in this debate. And if you're afraid you're going to lose, I understand that, but you shouldn't have the Supreme Court imposing your point of view on the rest of the country.
And we've been talking about Roe, but we actually do live in a Planned Parenthood versus Casey world, and that is a world in which many states have been allowed to pass restrictions on abortion, including waiting periods, including ultrasounds. My personal opinion is that those penalize low-income women when wealthy women can fly to states like New York and skip them. So I'm not afraid that I'm going to lose because women like me are going to be fine. I will always be able to get an abortion. I'm worried about the people who are completely disempowered, both politically and economically.
That's a great political point, and we can have a debate about it, and we are. And the Supreme Court should let that actually happen and play out.
Unfortunately, I'm going to cut it off there. Irin Carmon is senior correspondent at New York Magazine. Thank you, Irin.
Thank you.
Still with me are on the left, Liz Brunig of The Washington Post, and on the right, Rich Lowry of National Review. We will be back to talk about kids these days. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
Join the conversation on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW. Stream all episodes of Left, Right, and Center and other great shows at kcrw.com/podcasts.
The fact that in 2019 we're having this debate about measles vaccine makes my head want to explode.
We're just in this really strange place, and the only people speaking up are the parents. Endless Thread, the podcast from WBUR, Boston's NPR station, and Reddit, brings you a special series on the history of vaccines and anti-vaxxers.
Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm your host, Josh Barrow. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Elizabeth Brunig, columnist at The Washington Post. Now we're going to talk about kids these days. Everyone loves to talk about millennials. I'm a millennial. Liz is a millennial. But our next guest says the really big generational changes come with the generation after us, people born in 1995 and later. The oldest members of this generation are already in the workforce, while the youngest ones are still in second grade. People call them Generation Z, but our next guest proposes to call them iGen because of their intensely internet-connected childhood and adolescence, which will shape, among other things, how they engage with politics. Jean Twenge is a psychology professor at San Diego State University, and she's the author of 6 books, including iGen: Why Today's Super-Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood, and What That Means for the Rest of Us. Hi, Jean. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So I was interested in, you say in the book that 18-year-olds now act like 15-year-olds used to, 13-year-olds act like 10-year-olds, and you also say this was an abrupt shift, that normally we arbitrarily define generational cutoffs, and in fact we're having gradual change from year to year. But you see an abrupt shift in social behaviors that took place sort of around the beginning of this decade?
Yeah, so around 2011 or 2012, there was a much more sudden shift, particularly in variables around happiness and depression and optimism and expectations. Millennials had really continued some of those trends begun by baby boomers of more optimism, more focus on the self, and that just fell apart very suddenly around 2011 or 2012, which is when iGen became the teenagers and young adults.
And so how does that influence how they engage with politics? One thing you talk about is them being obsessed with safety. What does that mean they want out of government?
Well, we're still trying to figure that out. The oldest of iGen are 24. So what's very interesting about their interest in safety is how much they have embraced rather than rebelled against the societal emphasis on kids and teens staying safe. So you think about teenagers, usually you think, oh, they're going to take risks and they're going to want to live on the edge, and they're not going to want to listen to their parents when their parents tell them to drive carefully or not do drugs or not drink alcohol or not have sex. But iGeners have done a lot of those things. They've really embraced a lot of those messages. And they've also extended safety. So it's not just about physical safety. It's also about what they call emotional safety. So there's a lot of people paying attention to the politics on college campuses who are distressed to see that there's some college students who say, I don't want to have a conversation with someone who I disagree with because that makes me feel not safe. It's like almost a mission creep of the word safe and the interest in safety, of that safety in some cases now extends to the idea that I don't want to have a discussion with someone who might have different political views from myself.
Liz, this is talking about people just a few years younger than you. Do you see this?
So I've always thought that in the space of college campuses, the argument that it's unsafe to be having conversations that are disrespectful in certain respects to people with certain identities, sexuality, or gender expressions, etc., that's just part of normal liberalism. It's part of what's called public reason, the idea that you can tolerate any viewpoint being expressed in a liberal society except those that are antithetical to the ideal of liberalism itself, which would hold that all people are equal agents and actors deserving of equal political protection. So I think you see that expressed in all kinds of different ways in every generation of liberalism. This one just happens to have relevance to particularly hot-button issues. So it aggravates a certain amount of attention. I do know lots of people younger than me, including a bunch of teenagers, because I had kids really young for a millennial. A lot of my friends are actually much older than me and have much older kids. So I end up knowing a lot of teens. And I can't really fault them for what seemed like really reasonable and good life decisions, like not doing drugs, driving very safely, using public transportation, eschewing cars, caring about the climate. The kids really seem quite all right to me.
Yeah, Rich, this is a funny thing. I mean, it used to be a big thing in politics, worrying about, our teenagers having sex and, what are going to be the negative effects of that. And then teenagers are not having sex anymore. And then people are worried like, oh, no, teenagers aren't having sex. Are they ever going to have sex?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. It's almost as if kind of the dazed and confused, from that movie, that kind of high school lifestyle, was that actually more conducive to the happiness and ultimate well-being of adolescents than the obsession with the screens they have now, which seems to be associated with what Jean is putting her finger on, this decline in happiness. But maybe that's true. It's something I never would have expected.
Yeah, Jean, how much of this really is about screens? I mean, you see with parents now screen time panic and trying to, make sure that their children have less virtual interaction and more real life interaction. Do you really believe that is at the center of the sort of the personality and outlook differences of this generation versus the older ones?
It certainly appears to be. And I should be clear that those trends around alcohol and sex and dating and so on, those show a little bit of a different time sequence. They start late 90s. So they're really something that millennials began and iGen continued. And there's trade-offs involved in those trends. And they're not just about technology. They're about just taking longer to grow up. And they're not all good and they're not all bad. Some things like less alcohol and less sex, clearly seem like good trends. But is it good or bad that fewer teens have paid jobs or that fewer have a driver's license? It's probably neither one. So if you look at it just in terms of good and bad, you're going to miss the big picture, which is really in terms of the speed of development. And those trends are somewhat related to technology, but they began before smartphones. They accelerated in the age of smartphones, but it's clearly not the only thing going on there. Where you do see a much clearer relationship is that happiness and life satisfaction started to decline around 2011 or 2012. Symptoms of depression, clinical level depression, self-harm, emergency room admissions for suicide attempts, actual suicides, all of those suddenly increased around 2011 or 2012 when many of them had been declining from Gen Xers to millennials, or at least staying steady. So that's a really sudden change. It happens at exactly the same time that smartphones became common, because we know from Pew Center polls that 2012 was the first year when the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. It's also around the time that social media use among teens moved from being optional, say about half of them doing it, to being almost mandatory, where now, for example, 90% of 17 and 18-year-old girls are on social media every day. So this was a really fundamental shift. And these things not only happened at the same time, but it's clear that that was the biggest change in teens' lives at that time. It wasn't a national event they might have read about. It wasn't something that happened to their parents that may have affected them indirectly. How they spend their time outside of school is something that affects them every single day for hours at a time. Because it's not just, more are spending time on their phones. They're spending less time with each other face to face. So we know that from these big national surveys as well. And they're also spending less time sleeping. So that's a big change in how they spend their time outside of school. It makes sense that that would have the biggest impact on their personal mental health. And so that's why I think those two are pretty closely connected.
Liz, is that something we need to worry about from a policy perspective? I mean, one other thing that we see in something that Jean talks about in her book is the interest of young people in socialism, also in libertarianism and some other things, but basically that, a reaction to greater feelings of insecurity in life and in society can draw people toward an idea that the government should do more to protect them. And that can be because of psychological factors, but then also because of, simultaneous, very real factors we've been seeing in the economy at the time that these people have been coming of age and the prolonged reaction to the Great Recession. I guess, is there something for the government to do for people if they're feeling more isolated and more vulnerable in a systematic way across the population?
It's really challenging. I mean, I think that it's difficult for the government to get involved in sort of small bore issues like people not making adequate or strong social connections or having those kind of supportive relationships. there do appear to be programs the government could enact that would support people in developing those relationships or those connections if they wanted to. A lot of this is on the family level, as we've talked about before, vacation time, time off to give parents time with kids, kids time with parents. But in terms of kids sort of, and this isn't just kids, this is young adults, people my age and so forth, being sort of permanently attached to a social media world, which can be extremely abusive, very alienating, and very disturbing. I mean, I think that as with all alienation, you have a typical slate of socialist policies that aim to make people more secure materially. It's very hard to do that emotionally, especially when you've grown up in the aftermath of a recession. So I would say this is one for sort of those institutions in society that aim to shore up people on the inside in ways the government can't necessarily reach: churches, community groups, community organizations, and so forth.
Yeah, Rich, this sort of echoes something that Tim Carney's written about. We had him on the show a couple of months ago to talk about his book, Alienated America, and this worry about declining community institutions, churches and civic associations and smaller families and that sort of thing. And again, I guess the question is, even if you think that's a problem, what is there to be done about it?
Yeah, I think Tim makes a very good case. He has I hate to say it, Liz, we have an anti-socialism issue of National Review out, a special anti-socialism issue. Most issues of National Review, I guess, are anti-socialism issues. But Tim has a piece in that issue making the same case he has about the Trump phenomenon, that he sees socialism and nationalism as kind of a replacement of this community and this element of civic life that's really eroded. But it's one of these many things. I don't know what government can do about it. I had a conversation with a Republican policymaker who's very much on the kind of populist side of the Republican debate about tech, and he was citing some of this research about how bad cell phones are for teenagers. But I'm not sure what you do about that. I mean, the fact is, I think excessive TV viewing is probably the research probably shows that's bad for kids and teenagers as well. But we don't have any government rules to discourage viewing of it. Ultimately, it's personal responsibility and up to the parents. So, no, I'm not sure what a government solution to any of this is.
Jean, what do you think is to be done? I mean, obviously, a theme in your book is that some of this sounds pretty alarming. Is there anything to address it?
So first, yes, TV viewing is, if you do it excessively, is also not good. But it is not as strongly associated with depression and unhappiness as spending a lot of time on, say, social media. The other thing is, kids don't bring TV sets to school. So that shows a good way forward. That's one possible public policy avenue, is to get smartphones out of schools, say bell to bell. So kids need them, especially by high school, before school and after school, for coordinating pickups or driving themselves or taking public transportation. But during the school day, there's really no reason for them to have their own personal smartphone. When they do, it's a huge distraction in the classroom. And then kids don't talk to each other during lunch because they're looking at their phones. So school administrators tell me about this all the time. It used to be the kids would be talking to each other at lunch. The volume level in the cafeteria was very high, but they were engaging with each other. They were talking to each other face to face. And now the cafeteria is eerily silent as they all sit next to each other looking at their phones.
Well, that seems a very good proposal. Sign me up for that.
Jean Twenge is a researcher and a psychology professor at San Diego State University. Thank you, Jean, for joining us.
Thank you.
We have reached that time once again for our famed left, right, and center rants featuring pet peeves from across the political spectrum. Liz Brunig, what's your rant?
So an undercovered or maybe overcovered, depending on how you look at it, aspect of this week's news was Alyssa Milano's sex strike, which was intended to, I guess, inflict a little bit of pressure on men in response to the passage of these new laws in Alabama and Georgia. It was universally laughed at on the left. People did note the similarity to Lysistrata, but finally, even Alyssa Milano said it wasn't intended to be a real sex strike. It was more just to raise awareness about these issues by getting people to talk about sex in Hollywood, which is two things people love to talk about. But it did get covered, especially in the right wing, as though it were a real strike that were really happening. What bothers me, and I guess the subject of the rant ultimately, is that real strikes that really happen, like the ride-sharing strike that happened earlier this month and the Stop and Shop strike that happened last month, get much less coverage than fake strikes. And that really grinds my gears.
Rich Lowry, it's your soapbox.
Mea culpa. I underestimated Joe Biden's strength, at least out of the gate. in the Democratic primaries, but this is at least somewhat understandable since I'm a conservative pundit and a complete outsider to Democratic politics. What's amazing is it seems that almost every Democrat may have misunderstood the dynamic of the race as well and mispositioned themselves to compete with Biden for the middle of the Democratic electorate, which turns out to be much bigger than any of them realized.
For my rant, Alice Rivlin died this week at the age of 88. You may not have heard of Rivlin, but she shaped a lot of the institutions that shape our public policy in Washington today. She was the founding director of the Congressional Budget Office. She was also the first woman to serve as vice chair of the Federal Reserve, and under Bill Clinton, she was the first woman to run the Office of Management and Budget. The CBO has been a rigorous but often controversial scorekeeper whose estimates can make or break legislative proposals. Deficit reduction in particular has gotten a bad name lately. We've been through some unusual economic circumstances in the last decade that have made big deficits often desirable. But in the 1990s, Rivlin was correctly pushing for lower deficits that allowed for lower interest rates and stronger economic growth. Her legacy is left behind in the CBO and in the other Washington institutions she helped create. That is all we have time for today. I want to thank Rich Lowry, Liz Brunig, Irin Carmon, and Jean Twenge. Left, Right, and Center is produced by Sarah Fay. Our technical director is Kat Yor. Katie Burskins and Colin Cab Washington are our production assistants. Todd M. Simon composed our theme music. I'm Josh Barrow. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next week for more Left, Right, and Center.
Download and subscribe at kcrw.com/LRC, the KCRW app, or wherever you find podcasts. Left, Right, and Center is produced and distributed by KCRW.
KCRW sponsors include Roadside Attractions, presenting Trial by Fire. Based on a true-life Texas story, Trial by Fire stars Jack O'Connell as a death row inmate and Laura Dern as his ally who fights for his freedom. Now playing in theaters.